Hi everyone! So for this week's journal article, for my second journal article, I chose the article called From Plywood to Pixels, Career Transitions from Theater to Video Game Design. This article was written by Catherine Bradley with Sydney Warshaw. So just to give you a little bit of background on the author, Catherine Bradley, she is the resident costume designer at McGill University in Montreal, where she teaches costuming for theater and history of costume. And this is kind of what qualified her to have this sort of knowledge as a designer, and what I believe sparked her interest in this topic. So the main argument in this article is that not only is it possible for designers of set and costume and makeup and hair, not only is it possible for them to make these transitions into designing video games, it's actually quite important. It's becoming more and more important for people to have that eye that designers in theater have, because it's not just about the game, it's about the story, more so now than it was when games video games first came out. And that's kind of what she touches on in her introduction. And she also makes this really cool quote. It says, "Video game world design is the same type of work as theater, only virtual." And the quote is by Z. Linda Bathory. And Z. Linda Bathory is actually, she used to be a technical director and now works in the video game world as a game modeler. So she knows her stuff. So then the article goes on to kind of describe some of the jobs in video games that can translate to theater jobs. So one of the first ones she talks about is the lead designer. And the lead designer's responsibilities are mostly like a director's. They have the idea of the world they want to create, and it's their job to make it happen with the rest of the visual arts team. So among this team, there's the visual arts director. The visual arts director can translate to the set and costume designer. So they're responsible for creating the world, creating what the place is going to look like, and what the costumes are going to be like, all that kind of stuff. And then there are the visual artists, which she describes as makeup, hair, and costume designers that make the sprites, which are the characters. So a really cool one is are the environmental modelers and the level builders, which are much like our set designers, but only in the video game world they have the freedom to create pretty much whatever they want without the restriction of a budget, or without the restriction of can we do that or not, because in video games and technology you don't have to worry about if you can do that. You can pretty much come up with whatever you want and do it. So next are lighting designers. This one is really important because the lighting designers in the video game are responsible for creating mood, setting, and the atmosphere, which is exactly what lighting designers in theater have to do. So it's not just whether we can see the character or not, whether it's dark, whether it's light, it's also about, is this appropriate for what's happening in the game? So that's why it's important for that designer to have that ability that someone in theater would. And the last one she describes is the audio director, who is much like the sound designer. And one of the cool quotes is directly from the article is, again, as games are becoming more sophisticated, they are moving into more nuanced sound environments, well past the waka 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 sound of Pac-Man swallowing his pellets. So if you think about that, it's not just about sound effects and is this appropriate for the sound. It's also, again, about creating mood, which a lot of times the sound designers are responsible for as well in theater. Then she begins to talk about some of the benefits that that people who design in theater have over somebody who just wants to program a game. So set and costume designers have a huge knowledge on the history, on the history of costumes, the history of architecture. That just that just goes hand in hand because there's so many period pieces in theater. And just like in theater, in video games, that same atmosphere is still there. So some of the video games she gives examples of are World of Warcraft, which is in the medieval period, Assassin's Creed, and Age of Empires, which is a game where you have to build a civilization from the ground up. So it is very important to have that knowledge of history with the costumes, the architecture, the props, everything. And then she says that with the way video games are changing, they're becoming so much more intricate and so much more detailed. The clothing is becoming so much more detailed. So then she says there's the digital texture artist, which having that background in scene painting, where you have to detail like beautiful scenery and add that light and shadow, add that depth and texture, that would definitely come in handy. So not only does she explain why it would be beneficial to have this background in theater design, she also reassures you that it is okay and it is possible for people who don't have that experience to work their way into the world of video game designing. So the designers of the video game who are part of the visual arts team are not in charge of actually having to program the video game itself. They're mostly responsible for the vision, which is kind of what the same job of the designers in theater have as well. The set designers design the set, but they don't always have a hand in actually building it. So being able to render and sketch, those still come in handy for people who design video games. Having basic knowledge of Photoshop helps as well, but she says that renderings and sketches are still being used. And many times she states how it's not enough to know how to use software. Because video games are becoming so interactive and so involved, it's important for the designers to have that ability to be able to draw the gamer into the world that they've created. So then she ends the article by saying that yes, oftentimes it can help to have a degree in illustration to work your way into that area of a video game design. But more often than not, it's not required. It just depends on the type of video game that's happening, the people who are working on the project, and what they're looking for. Because if they're looking for people who do have that eye for detail and that eye for creating the world of the game, then that's the kind of job that you want to look for and the kind of job that you want to apply for. And basically she gives the advice, just do your research and find out what they're looking for. And that it's very possible to make that transition from designer in theater to video game designer. So overall, I do think that the argument was well justified. I think she made several cases and explanations for several different types of designers in theater that can make the transition into video game designing. As far as the organizational structure, I felt that this article was organized very differently from the other articles I've read. The other ones were broken up into sections and with the clear introduction, clear sections, and clear conclusion. And this one kind of, you could see there was an introduction, but she kind of skipped around from idea to idea. And while I understood her, I followed what she was saying, I did get lost at some times. But then it did eventually lead to her conclusion, but overall it still supported her argument. And I do believe that this article can move theater forward because, again, it shows that theater is not just limited to the stage. Being able to design and having this knowledge that a set designer, a costume designer, makeup hair designer have, being able to to apply those to other things like video game designing is really important, and it just opens up the door for what a person in theater can do. And then actually there was a little mini bonus separate article that was still part of the article. It was actually about women's roles in video game designing. And there was a really interesting statistic that stated that video games are now played in 72% of American households. 72%. So that definitely tells me that this is something that can move theater forward. It's constantly growing. The video game world is constantly growing, constantly changing, and constantly seeking ways to speak to their audience, to their gamer audience, and it can only help them to have people who have experience in theater on their side. And then more interestingly, that little mini article stated that they're constantly trying to change the way that video games appeal to both genders, not just guys, but also women. So not only is it opening the doors for people in theater, it's also opening the doors for women in theater, not just men. So I definitely feel that this concept can move theater forward. So that pretty much covers it. Thank you. Bye-bye.